Welcome to the deep dive. We've got a geopolitical puzzle in front of us today that genuinely reads like the plot of a political thriller, and we are thrilled to have you with us to explore it.
Yeah, it really does have all the elements.
Right. So I want you to imagine a geographic paradox for a second. How does a completely landlocked nation, home to, over 130 million people, go about building a navy and projecting what military strategists call sea power?
It sounds, it sounds like a fundamental contradiction. I mean, you can't have a navy without an ocean.
Exactly.
Yet that is precisely the strategic reality currently unfolding right now in the Horn of Africa.
It is. So today we're exploring Ethiopia's strategic use of its new BRICS membership to navigate this incredibly complex, frankly dangerous challenge of gaining access to the Red Sea.
And we have a really fascinating stack of sources for you today.
We do. We're pulling from geopolitical think tank reports, detailed economic analyses, and regional news coverage from outlets like the Horn Review, Addis Standard, and United World International.
And our mission for this deep dive is to neutrally map out the historical, economic, and geopolitical chess moves Ethiopia is making right now. They're attempting to secure a maritime future and essentially rewrite their geographic destiny.
All while navigating a neighborhood where one wrong move could spark a wider regional war.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the sheer scale of the maneuvers Ethiopia is attempting today, we really have to look at the baseline. How did a country with the demographic and economic weight of Ethiopia end up without a single mile of coastline?
Right. To find that baseline, you have to rewind to 1993.
Okay.
Following a protracted, decades-long conflict, the secession of Eritrea became official. When the borders were finally drawn up, Eritrea retained the entire coastline along the Red Sea.
So overnight, Ethiopia went from having a significant maritime presence to being entirely landlocked.
Exactly. Fast forward to the present day, and that geographical reality has created a massive logistical choke point. Ethiopia currently relies on its tiny neighbor, Djibouti, for roughly 95% of its imports and exports.
95%. When you really think about the scale of that, it's staggering.
It's immense.
We are talking about the supply chain for 130 million people. Food, fuel, industrial materials, all funneling through a single external corridor. That isn't just an economic bottleneck, it's an existential vulnerability.
Absolutely.
And the domestic landscape leading up to this current push for sea access has been incredibly turbulent, hasn't it?
Very. In 2018, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed comes into power, initiates sweeping domestic reforms, and actually secures a historic peace deal with Eritrea.
Right. That move won him the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
To the outside observer, it looked like a new era of permanent regional stability had finally arrived.
It certainly appeared that way. But the underlying tensions hadn't vanished, and that stability fractured very quickly. Between 2020 and 2022, the devastating Tigray War broke out internally.
Yeah.
And that conflict didn't just cause immense domestic suffering, it completely, drastically shifted Ethiopia's geopolitical standing.
How so?
Well, during the war, the Ethiopian government faced intense criticism from its traditional Western partners. The United States and European nations applied immense pressure. And there was a very real, looming threat of severe economic and diplomatic sanctions coming from the United Nations.
But those UN Security Council sanctions never materialized.
No, they didn't.
And the reason they didn't materialize completely altered Ethiopia's foreign policy trajectory, didn't it?
That is the critical pivot point right there. China and Russia, both holding permanent seats and veto power on the UN Security Council, stepped in to block those sanctions against Ethiopia.
Wow.
India, sitting as a non-permanent member at the time, also threw its support behind Addis Ababa. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how domestic survival directly drives foreign policy.
Ethiopia realized in real time that its historical reliance on Western alliances was a massive vulnerability during an internal crisis.
Precisely. Western aid often comes with human rights conditionalities or demands for domestic policy shifts. China and Russia offered a different model: diplomatic shielding without the internal scrutiny.
Right.
This structural shift effectively forced Ethiopia to diversify its diplomatic portfolio and seek out partners who view sovereignty and internal affairs differently.
Which brings us to January 2024. This is the moment the regional chessboard gets flipped. Ethiopia signs a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with Somaliland.
A huge moment.
Now, for those following the regional map, Somaliland is a breakaway region of Somalia. They declared independence back in 1991. They have their own currency, their own government. But crucially, nobody in the international community officially recognizes them as a sovereign, independent state.
Nobody.
So from an international law perspective, how does Ethiopia even justify signing a treaty with an entity that technically doesn't exist?
That is the exact legal and diplomatic gray area that is driving their neighbors crazy. Ethiopia is essentially gambling that the strategic gain outweighs the diplomatic fallout.
The MOU stipulated that Ethiopia would take the unprecedented step of officially recognizing Somaliland's independence.
Right, and in exchange, Somaliland agreed to lease 20 kilometers of its Gulf of Aden coastline to Ethiopia for 50 years.
And we need to be really clear about the nature of this lease.
Yes.
This isn't just an agreement to build a commercial port to offload cargo ships. The explicit purpose of this land lease is for Ethiopia to construct a sovereign military naval base.
A landlocked nation leveraging a legally unrecognized breakaway state to build a military installation on another country's claimed shoreline.
You don't need to be a geopolitical analyst to anticipate the regional backlash.
No, you don't.
It was immediate and it was fierce.
Objectively mapping out the responses, the reaction was a unified front of opposition, though for very different reasons. Somalia naturally outright rejected the deal.
Yeah, Mogadishu views any agreement with Somaliland by a foreign power as a flagrant violation of its territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Then you look at Eritrea. Despite that 2018 peace deal, historical memory is long in the Horn of Africa. Asmara fears this MOU is the first signal of a renewed Ethiopian expansionism.
But the loudest and most consequential reaction came from further north. Egypt's response wasn't just diplomatic outrage, it was an activation of their national security apparatus.
For Cairo, anything that alters the balance of power in the Red Sea is an existential issue.
Because it directly impacts navigation through the Suez Canal, which is the lifeblood of the Egyptian economy. Plus, as we will discuss shortly, Egypt already views Ethiopia as a threat due to ongoing water disputes.
Right, the dam.
So for Egypt, an Ethiopian naval base isn't just a provocation, it is a compounding, multi-front threat.
And that threat perception triggered a full-scale containment strategy from Egypt. You can almost think of their response like a geopolitical game of Go, where Egypt started rapidly placing pieces on every surrounding square to trap their opponent.
Interesting analogy.
By August 2025, Cairo was actively providing direct military aid and deploying troops to Somalia under the banner of regional security. Wow. Later that same year, Egypt went further, securing its own strategic port deals in Assab, Eritrea, and Dorla in Djibouti. The Egyptian Foreign Ministry even began aggressively pushing a new regional doctrine, stating that only shoreline countries have any inherent right to a role in Red Sea governance.
They were explicitly drawing a line in the sand to box Ethiopia out as a non-shoreline state.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the pressure in the region reached a boiling point, prompting Djibouti to step in. Djibouti makes incredibly lucrative transit fees from Ethiopian imports, so they need stability.
They do.
To diffuse the tension and offer an off-ramp, Djibouti offered Ethiopia full 100% commercial use of their Tajura port. It was a golden ticket for trade. But Ethiopia completely ignored the offer.
They did.
Why turn down guaranteed commercial access when your economy relies on it?
Because a commercial port doesn't solve their core strategic vulnerability. Ethiopia's calculus has evolved past simply needing to move shipping containers. They realize that relying on another nation's commercial port still leaves their economic throat in someone else's hands.
Their ultimate goal is sovereign, independent maritime projection, a naval base they control entirely to protect their own maritime interests without asking for permission.
Precisely. Djibouti's offer was an economic band-aid for a geopolitical problem.
So facing a neighborhood that is actively militarizing to contain them, Ethiopia needed a mechanism to bypass those regional gatekeepers entirely.
And that mechanism arrived in January 2024, at the exact same time they signed the Somaliland MOU. Ethiopia officially entered the newly expanded BRICS alliance.
The timing of that entry is crucial. With the recent expansions adding nations like Egypt, Iran, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Ethiopia to the original core, this bloc now commands massive global gravity.
We are looking at a coalition representing roughly 36% of global GDP and 47% of the entire human population. For Ethiopia, BRICS is a ladder to climb over the regional walls being built around it.
Let's look at how that ladder functions in practice. We mentioned Egypt's attempt to establish that shoreline doctrine, the idea that if your borders don't touch the water, you have no say in the Red Sea. BRICS provides Ethiopia with an entirely different framework to operate within, bypassing that regional doctrine.
It does. BRICS operates on a different set of foundational principles, heavily prioritizing global South autonomy, consensus building, and systemic relevance over mere territorial proximity.
Right.
Within the BRICS framework, Ethiopia is arguing that its sheer demographic weight, coupled with its total economic reliance on those waters, makes it an undeniable stakeholder. They're using the global platform of BRICS to assert that their influence shouldn't be constrained by where colonial-era borders were drawn in the sand.
We're already seeing the physical military dimension of this global end run play out. Back in 2019, Ethiopia quietly reconstituted its navy on paper, but by 2025, they had established a permanent operational naval headquarters.
Yeah.
And the location of this headquarters is fascinating. It's in Addis Ababa. They built the command center for a navy in a capital city that is completely surrounded by land, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean.
The logistics of that are fascinating, but it highlights a long-term, unshakable commitment to building maritime capability, regardless of current geography. But the true geopolitical signal wasn't the building in Addis Ababa. It came during the Will for Peace 2026 naval exercises.
Right.
These were massive, complex BRICS plus naval drills held off the coast of South Africa. And there was Ethiopia participating as an official observer alongside naval powers like Brazil and Indonesia.
That is a massive geopolitical loophole.
Yeah.
You have Ethiopian naval officers observing deep water, complex maritime maneuvers thousands of miles away from the Red Sea in the territorial waters of a BRICS ally.
That is the perfect way to describe it. A loophole. By utilizing the BRICS network, Ethiopia can rebuild its naval doctrine, study logistics coordination, and develop operational competence without putting a single ship in the Red Sea and triggering an immediate kinetic conflict with Egypt or Somalia.
It signals global inclusion. Regional actors might try to freeze them out, but by participating in these exercises, a major global alliance is recognizing Ethiopia as a legitimate, credible stakeholder in international maritime security.
This ambition directly taps into a theory our sources highlight extensively, Alfred Thayer Mahan's concept of sea power. Mahan argued that a nation's greatness, its economic security, and its global leverage are all inherently tied to its ability to control and utilize maritime trade routes.
And if you look at a map of the newly expanded BRICS, nowhere is the application of sea power more apparent than the Red Sea. That single body of water facilitates over 10% of all global trade. The expanded BRICS bloc is now heavily concentrated right around the world's most critical maritime choke points. You have Egypt controlling the Suez Canal in the north, and nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and now Ethiopia clustered around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the south.
The geopolitical leverage of controlling those choke points is immense. But we really need to ground this back in the domestic reality for Ethiopia. Why take all these risks? Because the economic engine of the country is desperate for fuel.
Exactly. Ethiopia has a young, rapidly growing population of 130 million. Their public debt currently stands at roughly 40% of their GDP. They need massive infrastructure funding, and they need it yesterday.
That pressing economic urgency is the true domestic driver of this entire foreign policy pivot. BRICS isn't just a political club. It offers tangible financial mechanisms. Chief among them is the New Development Bank, or NDB.
Right, the NDB.
For a developing nation, the NDB represents an alternative financing model. When a country goes to the IMF or the World Bank for a bailout or infrastructure loan, that money usually comes with strict structural conditionalities. Demands to cut public spending, privatize state assets, or alter domestic policies.
But the NDB operates differently.
It does. It offers what many developing nations view as strings-free cash for infrastructure without the heavy-handed domestic interference.
And when you pair that alternative funding with the African Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA, the strategy really comes into focus.
Mm-hmm.
The AfCFTA is actively uniting 1.4 billion people across the continent into a single tariff-free market.
Huge market.
According to the economic analyses in our sources, Ethiopia is already leveraging these new protocols to export agricultural products and meat to markets in Kenya, Somalia, and South Africa.
By combining the investment power of BRICS partnerships with the open markets of the African Free Trade Zone, Ethiopia is trying to attract massive foreign direct investment.
They're specifically targeting growth sectors like agro-processing, scaling up renewable energy grids, solar and wind, and rapidly expanding their digital, fintech, and mobile money sectors.
There's also a highly targeted push to engage the vast Ethiopian diaspora. The legal and economic reforms currently taking place in Addis Ababa are designed to attract diaspora capital and technological expertise.
The strategy is to utilize that cultural knowledge to act as a bridge, connecting incoming BRICS investors with local, nuanced African markets.
But looking at the sources, it is crucial to note that this pivot toward BRICS and away from traditional Western alliances is not universally celebrated inside Ethiopia.
No, it's not.
Our sources include a fascinating study by the Ethiopian Economic Association, which surveyed 330 domestic experts. The results revealed a deeply divided, fractured domestic opinion.
And to be absolutely clear to you listening, our goal here is not to validate one side of this internal debate over the other, but simply to impartially report the findings from the scholarly research.
Right. The division highlighted in that study is stark. On one side of the debate, a bloc of experts views the BRICS accession as a masterstroke of diplomacy. They see it as a vital step for South-South cooperation, developing nations trading directly with other developing nations that successfully rescues Ethiopia from the diplomatic isolation it faced during the Tigray War.
But the other side of the survey results paints a very different picture. Critics within Ethiopia argue that the country was essentially dragged into the alliance, heavily influenced by the United Arab Emirates, which has its own extensive port management and strategic interests in the Red Sea.
Right.
These domestic critics are highly concerned that aggressively aligning with a bloc that is widely perceived globally as aiming to counter Western economic hegemony is a massive unforced error.
They worry it risks permanently alienating traditional Western aid and foreign direct investment, which, despite the new BRICS ties, the Ethiopian economy still heavily relies upon. This raises an important question, and it's the central dilemma for many emerging economies right now. In a rapidly shifting multipolar world, how does a developing nation balance the undeniable, immediate economic opportunities of new alliances against the long-term risk of burning bridges with established global financial powers?
It is a geopolitical high-wire act, and that high-wire act becomes incredibly precarious when we look at what our sources identify as the ultimate test of this new BRICS alliance, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the GERD.
Yeah.
It is the absolute elephant in the room when discussing relations between Ethiopia and Egypt.
It is the defining friction point of the region. The GERD is a massive, multi-billion-dollar hydroelectric project built by Ethiopia on the Blue Nile. For Ethiopia, the dam represents an absolute sovereign right.
It's viewed as an existential necessity to generate the electricity required to lift millions of its citizens out of poverty and power its industrialization.
But follow the river north, and the perspective completely flips. For Egypt, which relies on the Nile River for nearly all of its freshwater for agriculture and human consumption, the dam is viewed as a direct existential threat to its national survival.
The core of this decade-long dispute isn't necessarily about the dam existing. It's about the mechanics of the water flow.
Exactly. Egypt is demanding a legally binding international agreement detailing exactly how much water Ethiopia is required to release downstream, specifically during periods of extended multi-year droughts.
And Ethiopia has consistently refused to sign a binding agreement, arguing that doing so would permanently limit its sovereign right to future development.
And the diplomatic graveyard surrounding this issue is vast. Efforts by the United States to mediate a solution totally failed. Extensive efforts by the African Union have stalled out. Neither of those bodies had the combined leverage to force a compromise.
But now the dynamic has fundamentally changed. Both Egypt and Ethiopia sit at the exact same table as official equal members of the BRICS alliance.
Scholarly views across our research suggest this is a historic, defining test for the BRICS organization itself. With Western and African Union mediation effectively sidelined, BRICS has a unique, unprecedented window of opportunity to step in and mediate.
The stakes for the bloc are incredibly high. If BRICS can utilize its internal diplomatic weight to successfully mediate a solution based on international law between two of its own heavyweight members, it will permanently cement its legitimacy globally.
It would prove that BRICS is not just an economic forum, but a true, functional alternative to the UN-led global order, capable of resolving deep existential conflicts without requiring Western intervention.
But the flip side of that scenario is just as profound. If the GERD dispute, compounded by the escalating tensions over the Somaliland naval base and Red Sea access, ends up fracturing the bloc or paralyzing its internal meetings, it will validate all the skeptics.
It will prove to the world that BRICS is merely a transactional alliance of convenience, a photo-op club incapable of genuine political cohesion when core national interests collide.
So what does this all mean? We've covered an immense amount of ground today, moving from the loss of a coastline in the 90s to the potential rewiring of global alliances today. The core takeaway from the stack of sources we've analyzed is that Ethiopia is aggressively utilizing a global multilateral platform, BRICS, to forcefully rewrite its regional geographic destiny.
They're refusing to accept the limits imposed by their immediate borders and their landlocked status.
They're executing a bold, highly risky strategy using global diplomatic weight to counterbalance an immediate regional containment strategy. It is a fascinating case study in how domestic economic survival becomes inextricably intertwined with macro-level geopolitical shifts.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as you digest all of this. If a landlocked nation can leverage a global economic alliance to legally build a navy, Project Sea Power, and systematically bypass the blockades of its immediate neighbors, what does the concept of geographic borders actually mean in a multipolar world?
Are maps becoming less about physical landmasses and proximity, and more about the invisible networks of who you are aligned with economically?
It challenges our most basic assumptions. It completely redefines how we understand state power, sovereignty, and the limits of geography in the 21st century.
It absolutely does. And the maneuvers in the Horn of Africa are just one piece of a much larger global puzzle. To keep following this geopolitical thread, be sure to catch our next deep dive.
We're going to explore how the shifting control of these exact maritime choke points by BRICS nations is poised to completely rewire global supply chains.
We'll be looking specifically at how this emerging control impacts Western economies, shipping logistics, and the future of digital trade networks. It is the natural next step in this story, and you won't want to miss it.
Thank you for taking the time to explore the depth and complexity of this issue with us today.
Yes, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We love unpacking these incredibly intricate topics with you, and we will see you next time.